Section 11 of the Public Orations of Demosthenes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Public Orations of Demosthenes, translated by Arthur Wallace Pickard. On the Embassy, Part 1. How much interest this case has excited, men of Athens, and how much canvassing has taken place must, I feel sure, have become fairly evident to you all after the persistent overtures just now made to you while you were drawing your lots. Yet I will make the request of you all, a request which ought to be granted even when unasked, that you will not allow the favour or the person of any man to weigh more with you than justice and the oath which each of you swore before he entered the court. Remember that what I ask is for your own welfare and for that of the whole state, while the entreaties and the eager interest of the supporters of the accused have for their aim the selfish advantage of individuals, and it is not to confirm criminals in the possession of such advantages that the laws have called you together, but to prevent their attainment of them. Now I observe that while all who enter upon public life in an honest spirit profess themselves under a perpetual responsibility, even when they have passed their formal examination, the defendant Aeschines does the very reverse. For before entering your presence to give an account of his actions, he has put out of the way one of those who appeared against him at his examination, and others he pursues with threats, thus introducing into public life a practice which is of all the most atrocious and most contrary to your interests. For if one who has transacted and managed any public business is to render himself secure against accusation by spreading terror around him, rather than by the justice of his case, your supremacy must pass entirely out of your hands. I have every confidence and belief that I shall prove the defendant guilty of many atrocious crimes, for which he deserves the extreme penalty of the law. But I will tell you frankly of the fear which troubles me in spite of this confidence. It seems to me, men of Athens, that the issue of every trial before you is determined as much by the occasion as by the facts. And I am afraid that the length of time which has elapsed since the embassy may have caused you to forget the crimes of Aeschines, or to be too familiar with them. I will tell you therefore how, in spite of this, you may yet, as I believe, arrive at a just decision and give a true verdict today. You have, gentlemen of the jury, to inquire and to consider what are the points on which it is proper to demand an account from an ambassador. He is responsible first for his report, secondly, for what he has persuaded you to do, thirdly, for his execution of your instructions, next for dates, and besides all these things, for the integrity or venality of his conduct throughout. And why is he responsible in these respects? Because on his report must depend your discussion of the situation. If his report is true, your decision is the right one. If otherwise, it is the reverse. Again, you regard the counsels of ambassadors as especially trustworthy. You listen to them in the belief that they have personal knowledge of the matter with which they were sent to deal. Never, therefore, ought an ambassador to be convicted of having given you any worthless or pernicious advice. Again, it is obviously proper that he should have carried out your instructions to him with regard to both speech and action, and your express resolutions as to his conduct. Very good. But why is he responsible for dates? Because, men of Athens, it often happens that the opportunity upon which much that is of great importance depends lasts but for a moment, and if this opportunity is deliberately and treacherously surrendered to the enemy, no subsequent steps can possibly recover it. But as to the integrity or corruption of an ambassador, you would all, I am sure, admit that to make money out of proceedings that injure the city is an atrocious thing and deserves your heavy indignation. Yet the implied distinction was not recognized by the framer of our law. He absolutely forbade all taking of presents, thinking, I believe, that a man who has once received presents and been corrupted with money no longer remains even a safe judge of what is to the interest of the city. If then I can convict the defendant Aeschines by conclusive proofs of having made a report that was utterly untrue, and prevented the people from hearing the truth from me, if I prove that he gave advice that was entirely contrary to your interests, that on his mission he fulfilled none of your instructions to him, that he wasted time during which opportunities for accomplishing much that was of great importance were sacrificed and lost to the city, and that he received presents in payment for all these services in company with Philocrates, then condemn him, and exact the penalty which his crimes deserve. If I fail to prove these points, or fail to prove them all, then regard me with contempt, and let the defendant go. I have still to charge him, men of Athens, with many atrocious acts in addition to these, acts which would naturally call forth the execration of every one among you. But I desire, before all else that I am about to say, to remind you, though most of you I know remember it well, of the position which Aeschines originally took up in public life, and the speeches which he thought it right to address to the people against Philip. For I would have you realize that his own actions, his own speeches at the beginning of his career, are the strongest evidence of his corruption. According to his own public declaration at that time, he was the first Athenian to perceive that Philip had designs against the Hellenes, and was corrupting certain leading men in Arcadia. With Iskander, the son of Neoptolemus, to second him in his performance, he came before the council, and he came before the people to speak on the subject. He persuaded you to send envoys in all directions to bring together a congress at Athens to discuss the question of war with Philip. Then, on his return from Arcadia, he reported to you those noble and lengthy speeches which, he said, he had delivered on your behalf before the 10,000 at Megalopolis, in reply to Philip's spokesman, Hieronymus, and he described at length the criminal wrong that was done, not only to their own several countries, but to all Hellas, by men who took bribes and received money from Philip. Such was his policy at that time, and such the sample which he displayed of his sentiments. Then you were induced by Aristodemus, Neoptolemus, Ctesiphon, and the rest of those who brought reports from Macedonia, in which there was not an honest word, to send ambassadors to Philip and to negotiate for peace. Aeschines himself is appointed one of them, in the belief, not that he was one of those who would sell your interests, or had placed confidence in Philip, but rather one who would keep an eye on the rest. The speeches which he had already delivered, and his antipathy to Philip, naturally led you to take this view of him. Well, after this, he came to me and tried to make an agreement by which we should act in concert on the embassy, and urged strongly that we should both keep an eye upon that abominable and shameless man, Philocrates. And until we returned to Athens from the first embassy, I, at least, men of Athens, had no idea that he had been corrupted and had sold himself. For, not to mention the other speeches which, as I have told you, he had made on former occasions, at the first of the assemblies in which you debated about the peace, he rose and delivered an exordium, which I think I can repeat to you word for word as he uttered it at the meeting. If Philocrates, he said, had spent a very long time in studying how he could best oppose the peace, I do not think he could have found a better device than a motion of this kind. The peace which he proposes is one which I can never recommend the city to make, so long as a single Athenian remains alive. Peace, however, we ought, I think, to make. And he made a brief and reasonable speech in the same tone. But though he had spoken thus at the first meeting, in the hearing of you all, Yet at the second meeting, when the peace was to be ratified, when I was upholding the resolution of the allies and working for a peace on just and equitable terms, when you, in your desire for such a peace, would not even listen to the voice of the despicable Philocrates, then, I say, Aeschines rose and spoke in support of him, using language for which he deserves, God knows, to die many deaths, saying that you must not remember your forefathers, nor tolerate speakers who recalled your trophies and your victories by sea, and that he would frame and propose a law that you should assist no Hellene who had not previously assisted you. These words he had the callous shamelessness to utter in the very presence and hearing of the ambassadors whom you had summoned from the Hellenic states, in pursuance of the advice which he himself had given you before he had sold himself. You elected him again, men of Athens, to receive the oaths. How he frittered away the time, how cruelly he injured all his country's interests, and what violent mutual enmity arose between myself and him in consequence of his conduct and of my desire to prevent it, you shall hear presently. But when we returned from this embassy, which was sent to receive the oaths, and the report of which is now under examination, when we had secured nothing, either small or great, of all that had been promised and expected when you were making the peace, but had been totally deceived, when they had again acted without regard to their instructions, and had conducted their mission in direct defiance of your decree, we came before the council, and there are many who have personal knowledge of what I am about to tell you, for the council chamber was crowded with spectators. Well, I came forward and reported to the council the whole truth. I denounced these men. I recounted the whole story, beginning with those first hopes aroused in you by the report of Ctesiphon and Aristodemus, and going on to the speeches which Aeschines delivered during the time of the peace negotiations, and the position into which they had brought the city. As regards all that remained to you, I meant the Phocians and Thermopylae, I counselled you not to abandon these, not to be victims once more of the same mistake, not to let yourselves be reduced to extremities through depending upon a succession of hopes and promises, and I carried the council with me. But when the day of the assembly came, and it was our duty to address you, the defendant, Aeschines, came forward before any of his colleagues, and I entreat you in God's name to follow me and try to recollect whether what I tell you is true. For now we have come to the very thing which so cruelly injured and ruined your whole cause. He made not the remotest attempt to give any report of the results of the embassy, if indeed he questioned the truth of my allegations at all, but instead of this he made statements of such a character, promising you benefits so numerous and so magnificent, that he completely carried you away with him. For he said that, before his return, he had persuaded Philip upon all the points in which the interests of the city were involved in regard both to the Amphictyonic dispute and to all other matters, and he described to you a long speech which he professed to have addressed to Philip against the Thebans, and of which he reported to you the substance, calculating that, as the result of his own diplomacy, you would, within 2 or 3 days, without stirring from home or taking the field or suffering any inconvenience, hear that Thebes was being blockaded, alone and isolated from the rest of Boeotia, that Thespiae and Platae were being repeopled, and that the debt due to the god was being exacted not from the Phocians but from the Thebans who had planned the seizure of the temple. For he said that he gave Philip to understand that those who planned the act were no less guilty of impiety than those whose hands executed the plan, and that on this account the Thebans had set a price upon his head. Moreover, he said that he heard some of the Euboeans, who had been thrown into a state of panic and confusion by the friendly relations established between Athens and Philip, saying to the ambassadors, "You have not succeeded, gentlemen, in concealing from us the conditions on which you have made your peace with Philip, nor are we unaware that while you have given him Amphipolis, he has undertaken to hand over Euboea to you." There was indeed another matter which he had arranged as well, but he did not wish to mention this at present, since, even as it was, some of his colleagues were jealous of him. This was an enigmatic and indirect allusion to Oropus. These utterances naturally raised him high in your estimation. He seemed to be an admirable speaker and a marvellous man, and he stepped down with a very lofty air. Then I rose and denied all knowledge of these things, and at the same time attempted to repeat some part of my report to the council, but they now took their stand by me, one on this side, one on that, the defendant and Philocrates. They shouted, they interrupted me, and finally they jeered while you laughed. You would not hear, and you did not wish to believe anything but what Aeschines had reported. Heaven knows your feelings were natural enough, for who that expected all these marvellous benefits would have tolerated a speaker who said that the expectation would not be realized, or denounced the proceedings of those who made the promise? All else, of course, was of secondary importance at the time, in comparison with the expectations and the hopes placed before you. Any contradiction appeared to be nothing but sheer obstruction and malignity, while the proceedings described seemed to be of incredible importance and advantage to the city. Now, with what object have I recalled these occurrences to you before everything else, and described these speeches of his? My first and chief object, men of Athens, is that none of you, when he hears me speak of any of the things that were done and is struck by their unparalleled atrocity, may ask in surprise why I did not tell you at once and inform you of the facts, but may remember the promises which these men made at each critical moment, and by which they entirely prevented everyone else from obtaining a hearing. And that splendid pronouncement by Aeschines, and that you may realize that in addition to all his other crimes, you have suffered this further wrong at his hands, that you were prevented from learning the truth instantly when you ought to have learned it, because you were deluded by hopes, deceits, and promises. That is my first, and, as I have said, my chief object in recalling all these occurrences. But there is a second, which is of no less importance than the first. And what is this? It is that you may remember the policy which he adopted in his public life, when he was still uncorrupted, his guarded and mistrustful attitude toward Philip, and may consider the sudden growth of confidence and friendship which followed, and then, if all that he announced to you has been realized, if the results achieved are satisfactory, you may believe that all has been done out of an honest interest in the welfare of Athens. But if, on the other hand, the issue has been exactly the opposite of that which he predicted, if his policy has involved the city in great disgrace and in grave perils, you may then be sure that his conversion was due to his own base covetousness and to his having sold the truth for money. End of section 11.